Good evening and welcome to the Architectural Association. My name is Zach Kais and I'm the art director of the school. Before I begin, can I remind you to please switch off your mobile phones. I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's artist talk, which is in the context of the Bedford Press lecture series. The title is Exercises in Sharing Inhabitants, Settings, and a Gazette, and delighted to introduce Can Alte tonight. Before introducing Can, though, I'd like to say a few words about the framework for this talk. The 2010 and 11 Bedford Press lecture series invites practitioners from a myriad of disciplines, including art, architecture, exhibition making, and graphic design, to reflect upon the role of publishing within their respective practices. The talks organized this academic year present publishing, a topic which is of much renewed interest both in Bedford Square, particularly in the past weeks, and abroad as well. And all these initiatives that we've kind of invited to present here focus on kind of new ways of creating a public. Publishing, of course, in the original sense means making a public, and takes on both a double meaning here, offering something to a public, but also creating a public. This will perhaps become evident tonight in the work of Can Alte, an artist living in Istanbul, whose works take on a kind of hybrid form of publication, videos, and photographs, which incorporate research that he has done on the urban environment. Can studied architecture originally, I think, environmental design, before beginning an artistic practice that focused rather on the unplanned. So the improvised and the unsanctioned spaces of the city became kind of his site that he has worked upon. On the occasion of his first solo exhibition in London, Can transformed the showroom into the production site of a single edition newspaper, which we have here tonight. And this is called the Church Street Partners Gazette, which draws upon dialogues with people who Alte terms as partners. The role of publications reappears within the exhibition context in Ahali, a journal for setting a setting, which Alte edits. Can has had solo exhibitions in Berlin, Bilbao, and Bristol. His work has been included in the biennales in Istanbul, Havana, and Guangzhou, as well as Taipei, and museums and galleries across the world. He is co-founder of art, design, publishing collective Diplomacy and Reflex, and was the curator of the refugee section of the 4th Architecture Biennale in Rotterdam. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Philip Hartstein, Wayne Daly, Phil Clatworthy, Claire McManus, Asli Alte, and Emily Pethick at the showroom. And last but not least, I'd like to mention that there are 2 more lectures within this lecture series, Christoph Keller on March 4th, and Jesko Fazer on March 21st. And details of those are on the AA's website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach. Well, you pretty much covered everything I was going to say, but so I mean it's a very broad title, but the title of the talk, or the subtitle of the talk, includes the terms inhabitants, settings, and the gazette. So what I wanted to do today is basically to introduce what I mean and how I deal with this question of inhabitancy and the idea of settings, and then mention a couple of projects and end up with the Church Street Partners Gazette, which was my most recent project that took place at the showroom here in London. And as Zach said, we have quite a few copies of the Gazette here, so it's also basically, if you are interested, you can take them when you are leaving and read more. So, I mean, to start with this question of inhabitancy, I think what attracts me to being an inhabitant in a sense is, or in any space or system or kind of structure we come to inhabit, is partly the self-claimed ability to produce meaning within, or to a certain extent, to be able to kind of reconfigure various dimensions or aspects of where or what we inhabit. And this I'm trying to say in a very broad sense, but usually The examples I will talk about will refer to the city or the urban context. So, I mean, some of you might know, but I want to start with what has become my traditional introduction to speeches, which is a situation that's called minibar. And the minibar is basically a scene that I found myself within as well at the end of the 90s, beginning of 2000s, that was completely about, let's say, gentle occupation of space or in between space in the streets of Ankara in a particular area. So what it was is basically gathering for the sake of nightlife, but avoiding or removing the service sector in the sense that you were not going to the bars. So it started off something maybe more economically as a way to kind of get drunk for cheaper, but through time it became a whole scene of its own, and for me it showed this, it displayed this kind of possibility of, in a sense, transgression of the urban realm as it was planned. So there was a production of meaning that took place which was completely beyond the imagination or beyond the preconception of the planners, the architects, the builders, or the people who were living there. But also, as with space, it included, let's say, social, political, economical dimensions, as well as a physical inhabitation and physical creation of space, but it was doing it without building anything. It was just locating yourself at one corner and just utilizing whatever physical elements there were, and thus creating this kind of totally unconceived use or function or meaning, or however you want to name it. And I'm interested in these terms as well, pretty much interested, especially the clashes between function and meaning. So it basically also involved a great deal of invention, because you had to kind of invent your own cocktails, like cheap versions of mixing vodka, water, and how do you say, tank? So, or also a great deal of negotiation with the inhabitants, let's say the other inhabitants who were the residents in those buildings, in those apartment buildings, but also with the police, as it is by law prohibited to drink in public space. So it was also bringing together all of these different layers and aspects without having any ideological preoccupation. It was still a kind of a different sense of political space. A second situation I was very much intrigued and interested and had worked on is a profession, an unrecognized profession, paperman, as the people who do this job call themselves, and it is the work of dealing with garbage, let's say informal recycling sector. But the way they work is they navigate the streets and they take apart the recyclable material from the garbage bins before the official municipal garbage collection comes. So in a sense, they intervene, or they just inject themselves into this infrastructure, which is the municipal collection of garbage, and they just collect whatever material they can sell to recycling factories or wholesale dealers. And in a way, their position, again, vis-a-vis the system or the context, is for me quite interesting, because on the one hand, they work against the system, let's say. They disrupt the processes of the garbage collection, the official sector. But on the other hand, they support it to such an extent that the recycling rates in big cities of Turkey are so high. So in a sense, economically and ecologically, they are very supportive of the very system they are kind of inhabiting, almost parasitically. So the slides are a bit mixed up, but just one more note about maybe the minibar is that, of course, the public space or the urban space also always includes conflicts, and that's part of the deal, as I just mentioned. And this image is actually from a location which was a very popular minibar spot. And so in the beginning there used to be this stone wall in the bottom, and the youth used to gather there, just sit in a row, just hang out there. And one day you came and suddenly there was this built element, which was this brick wall that was completely built to prevent minibar from happening. So in a sense, the act of building was now being done to prevent space. Later, during the time, I mean, this is the same wall. You suddenly had a faux leather couch, because through the processes of time, then there was this new breed of entrepreneurs who came to the minibar scene, started renting or buying the ground floor flats of the buildings and building their own kind of cafes, which again had nothing to do with minibar. And how I work is then, of course, what I was doing was to kind of take these observations and material documentations and build installations that were putting these aspects and material into discussion, but also creating another kind of subspace within the context I was inhabiting, which was the art context, or which was the context of the gallery space or the museum. So in a sense, it was also trying to find a way of mirroring that inhabitancy within my own practice. So what inhabitancy implies is basically being inhabitant to a system, but also a space. Invention of certain acts, maybe you can say, or a practice or a sense of practice that reconfigures the system or the space you are within, but also always a conflict and negotiation with space and with your context. I mean, there are also other inhabitants or other kinds of inhabitants that I'm very much interested in, and these include animals and plants that live in the cities, and their habits, their habitats, and their kind of habitation within the urban context is also for me a kind of key example. And they too have their clashes and conflicts with the system, and both historically and contemporarily it also relates to stories of, let's say, extermination, deportation, and this kind of basically related to policies of hygiene or other stories that are totally built up to maintain these systems or structures. So, I mean, as a continuation of that, I mean, that same photo is over there on the wall. I started building or making up kind of constructs within the art context. Now with the aim to first create some sort of construct that calls for an assembly or puts forward this question of publicness and public space, and to discuss whether, to what extent or still you can consider the art context or the context of the museum or the gallery space as a public space, and to kind of deal with that through a series of settings that I call them as settings, which always incorporated different pieces of works or different practices or different productions. I mean, for example, this one in the front is a piece called A Damaged Plane, and it was basically a sound platform and an architectural element which had this embedded sound system that could be seen as an architectural element, but also as a sound system, as stage, but also as a place for the audience to sit together with the performer, or as an instrument, or just simply as a stage. And and that coincides with a moment in time that I was more and more interested in this question of setting a setting, whatever that might mean, and whether you can as Zach discussed about publication, whether you can make a public by also making things public, or whether you can propose some sort of situation or construct that calls for its own assembly, or that brings together a particular group of people that were not necessarily attached to each other in any other formal way. So Ahali was the title of the journal that I started in 2007, and this is the cover. It's called Ahali, a journal for setting a setting, and it's designed by Aslı Altay, who's also with us today. And so when I started, it started with a kind of series of issues. And by issues, I don't mean like periodical issues, but issues that were for me important to tackle and address. And it is a journal, but it doesn't work periodically. It's a growing collection of contributions, and the contributions include from like very straightforward written essays to more visual works and artist works as well. And for each launch, I design a kind of different display structure, and the main idea is that each contribution is printed as a separate pamphlet, and so the reader or the prospect reader has the ability to select their own collection, and then it's binded to the cover that we just this cover. It's binded to the cover within the site, within the location where you purchase the magazine. And there is again related to this to the urban context and the notion of conflicts. I've done, as again Zach mentioned, I co-curated an exhibition which was part of the Rotterdam Architecture Biennale that was called Refuge. And in Refuge, we were basically looking into the more and more severe urban conditions around the globe, but mainly in Middle Eastern cities, and looking into the ways in which how kind of space is becoming more and more kind of squeezed. This may have to do with more policies around, like, let's say, neoliberal policies of privatization of public space, but it may also have to do with a much more severe conflict related to war zones or the refugee hoods. But what we were trying to do is not only to document or address these issues, but look at architectural and urban practices. Because once you are in such a context that there is no longer a commission, there is no longer maybe not necessarily a budget, there is no longer necessarily a client. So all these conceptions of how you inhabit your profession, which let's say is architecture in this context, also becomes a big question. And then you have to maybe in a sense reinvent the professional practice as well. So we were looking into a wide array of practices around the world which had to do with ranged between more activist groups to mapping, but also very, very architectural practices as well. Yeah. So that was inhabitants and settings, and then we, a kind of, so let's say an urban condition, a changing urban condition, which was becoming more and more maybe severe, especially around the world in big cities. You are more and more seeing so-called redevelopment, regeneration projects, which always have a, let's say, social political aspect that is quite problematic. It usually has to do with a kind of shrinking of the public space, or with even like forced evictions and people having to move out of there where they live. And so the next project I did was, in a sense, for the first time I was doing something in the public space, and basically I was invited to do something in a park in Istanbul. This was a park that was a very small park in the center of Istanbul, and the park in itself was a kind of small micro, let's say, ecosystem that had almost all various aspects of the city, and it had its own inhabitants, people who lived there, also like 90 cats and I guess 16 dogs who were inhabiting this park, but also a huge amount of passerbys. And but the park was quite built as straightforward as a park. You couldn't step on the grass, or all these kind of regulations were at place. And especially in the context of Istanbul or in Turkey, when you talk about public space, you don't necessarily refer to public space as a kind of space of the public or the people, but you also refer to something very stately, something that belongs to the state, something that's about the state. And that's, of course, that's in English also, that's one of the meanings of the public, but in Istanbul in Turkey it's even more kind of out there. So I was more interested in two things. One, how I can intervene / contribute to the context of the park, and maybe introduce some different senses of living and relate to those that are already there, and also to what degree I can maybe blur the boundaries of authorships between myself and the other artists I have invited to join me in this process. So I invited Niels Norman, who is a British artist. I invited Ceren Oykut, who is a Turkish artist. I invited a gardening collective called Sinek Sekiz, who are also the publishers of, let's say, seminal essays and publications on ecology and those matters in Turkey, translating and publishing them. And then I invited a design studio which is called Future Anecdotes, to all kind of join in and build up some sort of installation, which was at once, as I said, an intervention to the park, but also hopefully some sort of contribution. So in the end, we had this, let's say, big structure, very similar in some ways to the settings, what they were trying to address in the context of more like internal spaces, but now they become out there, they become somewhere between like public furniture, but also there was literally people growing things. So there was this vegetables bed where like tomatoes and other vegetables were being grown, but it was also right next to a military museum, so a military base, which was also having a very strict boundary between the park. And so it had all these it has all these kind of different layers and aspects that I was trying to deal with. And for example, Future Anecdotes designed this let's say labeling system, which was also again related to this sense of publishing. The labels were also the pages of a publication that was published together with the park project. So each, like you see on the front, so each page, let's say, is a spread about each of the projects and a title of the exhibition, but it was also, I mean, it was at the same time working as a, how do you say, a label, a display, but also in a different context, it was also working as the publication. And then I spent some time in Warsaw, and as with all cities that I have been mentioning, Warsaw is also undergoing a great deal of transformation, and there's also a great deal of regeneration projects. But one particular context that struck me was the so-called Anniversary Stadium and the Vietnamese establishment, the Vietnamese population that lived around the Anniversary Stadium. Now the Anniversary Stadium is being taken down to make a new large stadium for the 2012 Cup, Football Cup. But in the process of making that happen, the communities also have to shift locations. Another case of like internal deportation or eviction is at place. But I was there visiting a derelict Vietnamese temple, and I came across this this lotus leaf sculpture, which had in front of it an empty pedestal. So the lotus leaf was obviously shelter to a sculpture of a goddess, which was taken away because it was sacred, but the pedestal and the lotus leaf remained. And I'm always very much interested, as you might have guessed, with the kind of formal aspects of the settings. I'm always very much interested in this idea of the pedestal and what an empty pedestal also might refer to. And as in this case, the empty pedestal might refer to a kind of removal, but it also at the same time may indicate that something will be placed there. So it's also something the pedestal is waiting for something to happen. So what I did was to basically, this piece was called Another Empty Pedestal, after similar skids in recent past. And so it was in a way, I was doing a show in Warsaw, so it was in a way returning to the settings, but keeping the formal aspects of these kind of pedestals, stairs, let's say the cubes around that, and the question of framing, but also now bringing together this very actual big piece of concrete sculpture which was removed from the Vietnamese temple. Now the gesture is kind of in a certain extent violent because to address the demolition, I'm even maybe contributing to that, but I'm also very much interested, as I said, this kind of binary or the kind of blurring between what contribution means and what intervention means. So it was in a sense also to be able to discuss that. I was removing that lotus leaf, which used to be a shelter, and bringing it together next to my another empty pedestal. And I mean, also in Warsaw there was another empty pedestal in the House of Culture, which was a gift from Stalin, but that's a whole different story, so I will skip that. So I want to talk a bit about the Church Street Partners Gazette project that I was involved in throughout a good duration of the last year here in London, in an area called the Church Street, as the name implies, and it's somewhere just off Edgware Road, so it's on the western side. So I was invited by the Showroom, which is a non-profit gallery, art space, who was located right in the center of the Church Street. And the moment I went there and started kind of looking around, trying to figure out where I am, what context I am inhabiting, or I will be inhabiting for the duration of the show, I found out about the regeneration plans and the kind of 20-year master plan that is at stake for the Church Street area. So I wanted to relate to that, primarily because I was going to inhabit the gallery that was right in the center of the area, and also secondly, of course, this was one of my main topics of interest. But I wanted to also tackle it in a sense that brings together my own practice in the sense of these settings, which are always allowing or addressing a certain type of production to take place within the gallery space, but also this notion of publication, which is something very immediate and very distributable as well. So in the end, I came up with a project that used the gallery space as a setting for a duration where the, let's say, the contact material was going to be generated, but also something that speaks on its own as well. So before the opening of the show, I organized a headlines workshop. I mean, I have no experience in journalism whatsoever. I didn't know what a newspaper, how a newspaper works, but of course I've been dealing a lot with different modes of publishing and publication. So I thought about starting from the opposite end. Usually in newspapers, the headline is something that is written at the very end of the story, right before the print, and usually it's something that generalizes, minimizes, or kind of compresses the story into one sentence. But I had no story, so I wanted to start making the stories, but I wanted to kind of instigate also other possibilities through a kind of these one sentences. So what I did was to organize this headlines workshop with people from the area and also people who are working there, a small group of people, and we came up with this number of headlines that were related to the neighborhood, to the area, but also related to the project that I was undertaking. And then we invited the artist who does the local pub signs, the letterist for all the pubs in the neighborhood, to draw us, to letter us these headlines that were then fitted into this kind of frame structure, wooden structure, that also for me in a sense mimicked, I mean again referred to this idea of framing, positioning, but also related to the ways in which you read a newspaper, which is always this fragments of information or fragments of spots of information, bits and pieces of knowledge and statements. So this was the space, and the space was also, I mean, there was also a series of photographs that were related to the neighborhood. There was a video piece, I can talk about it a bit later, but it was called Rogue Game, and it was a collaboration with Jonathan Mosley and Sophie Warren. So these are some other views from the space. But this central, let's say, the space defined by this frame structure had different uses and different functions. So different sorts of production was taking place. So these are some of the images from the occasions, from different time frames, where the space was also used, both physically but also mentally or content-wise in different ways. Oops. So what was at stake for me in the context of making the Gazette was, of course, also try and develop content in relation to the people that were living there. And I didn't do it in a sense of, I mean, it was a mutual relationship, or proposed to be a mutual relationship with the let's say inhabitants of the neighborhood, but it was also a bit tricky because I didn't want to plug myself into existing, almost institutionalized community groups which were already there and which were already quite active. So I really wanted the Gazette to generate a different sort of community, maybe a contingent community that was just there for the sake of making the newspaper happen in a sense, and hopefully to provide the discussions that comes with it. And also I should mention, I mean, the name Ahali of my previous publication, it comes from a Turkish word which refers to something you can translate as the people, which is something between a community and the public, but it only refers to a group of people that are at a particular place in a particular time, and that's the kind of that's their only commonality in a sense. So I always have big problems with maybe the oppressive qualities of communities because they are usually religious-based, kinship-based, or location-based, which I always see as kind of too tight for my liking. So the Ahali is much more of a loose establishment, and it changes all of the time. I mean, we are now here. We may if we call ourselves Ahali for this moment. I mean, thank you all very much for coming, but there might never be another occasion that we are all here together as the same set. So it's that kind of fluctuating mess, and I really I really find something valuable in that quality. So the Gazette was maybe aiming to create some sort of Ahali around the neighborhood. And what else? Yeah, and then to use the duration we used the duration of the exhibition to generate these contents, have different kinds of gatherings, meetings, and discussions and also open calls for authors from the neighborhood to join us and to write material. And in the end, it really built up to become a very interesting collection of pieces, essays, and other kinds of work that all had to do with these kind of pressing issues about the neighborhood, but also various qualities of the neighborhood. I mean, I was very much interested in this question of partnership, to what degree you can expand it. This context of transformation, obviously, the neighborhood was going through. And then the question of boundaries, because the Church Street is located somewhere in London, which is both divided by very physical boundaries. It's right next to the flyover that goes across the Edgware Road, and on its other side there's the Regent's Canal, and also historically there used to be the railroads drawing the other boundary. So it's like a triangle space in the center, quite impoverished, but right across the flyover and right across the canal you also have these very well-off, wealthy prime real estate, as well as kind of quite wealthy neighborhoods of London. So it had this kind of particular aspect that had to do with the question of boundaries as well. So the Gazette was in the end tackling all of these issues. And it came out as an end product. It came out as a result of the whole duration of the exhibition. Oops, yeah. I mean, I think that's all I want to say. But I mean, I'm happy to receive questions if you have any, or if you feel the need to go back to some projects or some occasion. I'm also happy to talk more.
Thank you. If we have questions, I have a microphone that I can bring to you. I wanted to start actually with a question that you mentioned, kind of expanding this idea of partnership. And I wondered if you could kind of elaborate on that, because partnership obviously has a certain definition, which is to kind of share in risk and also maybe reward. Yeah. So perhaps you could describe kind of what is at stake for you in these partnerships, because of course you refer here to partnership, but also in other projects there's this idea of...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it also relates to this question of inhabitancy, and I mean, we are all subjected to or part of various systems and structures, and we always have some sort of relation with these systems or structures, but there is also other people that are in the same position. But what I was trying to maybe get at is because partnership is also a phrase that's so commonly used in like urban development processes, public-private partnership, or let's say partnership usually refers to a very economical stakeholding, and usually relates to power actors that have a say. So I was trying to, in a sense, maybe intervene to the usage of the word partnership, but also, I mean, one of the headlines, I mean, I won't fake it, I wrote that one. It didn't came out as the workshop, out of the workshop, but neighbors claim partnership, or neighbors claim partnership. So it may be a kind of a shout or a kind of call, but it may also be past tense, neighbors, or in general neighbors claim partnership. So this, like, to what degree do you claim certain powers? I mean, it's a bit maybe romantic, and to what degree whether you can address inhabitants as partners, to what degree you can expand that notion of partnership, and also for everyone be responsible. But as you said, like it's a matter of feeling responsible or taking responsibility as well. And on a completely different level, partnership also involves, yes, it has that legal and economic meaning, but it also has a meaning that's related to love or friendship. So partnership also has this complete different aspect, which is used in a complete different context. So to kind of bring these dimensions together, but I don't have a kind of clear definition of partnership. It was more for me just trying to explore that.
Do we have any questions from the audience or the floor? I'm sure we do. No? Here we
I really enjoyed your definitions or variation on community. You mentioned there either based on religion, kinship, or location, and that the Ahali was a kind of more fluid way of looking at it. I'm just interested what you think about communities on the internet and virtual World Wide Web communities, and if you have any thoughts, are they?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I was in Istanbul. I was teaching this class on public space, and one of my students was completely involved in and literate in the kind of space of the web. So we were always discussing this, the publicness of the web. I mean, I'm not sure if I have an answer, but I mean, it's in the beginning, especially, it started off like, for example, people like Hakim Bey were claiming it started as with the promise of being able to produce temporary autonomous zones in his definition. And he was relating the story of the temporary autonomous zone to like pirate islands, like temporary spaces that claimed their own autonomy and that had their own community, their own space, which could disperse later on or which could remain. But we also have to see that the web, to a great extent, has been intensely privatized, and more your existence in the web is also participating or contributing to, let's say, more economical processes of marketing, of advertisement production, in that sense, commercial processes. And Hakim Bey himself I was just some years ago going back to a recent print, and he was quite disillusioned in the potentials of the web. And he was then referring about going back to like tactile space and referring to communities of enthusiasts, for example, people who are obsessed with certain things, that he was saying that they could create such temporary autonomous zones where it was still permeable, but you had to have some sort of maybe enthusiasm or interest that is very much directed towards something that's tangible, and that could bring you together. I mean, I'm not that that negative as he was kind of being disillusioned, because I didn't have any idea about how the web communities could work, and I'm not sure if I still have a clear idea, but I mean, it's a very interesting topic. Do you have an idea?
Just as you were talking, I think, just as you were talking, I was thinking about blogs and kind of another form of journalism that allows comments. I mean, I don't know, maybe journalism has this idea, the traditional journalism that you were kind of maybe reacting against or proposing an alternative for is very one way. It's done by this powerful organization that that says what the news is and prints it, and it's one way.
Yeah.
But perhaps, I don't know, there's...
I mean, this project, thank you very much for elaborating, because it's, I mean, I just tried to give an overview of all the projects, but that was actually one of the very fundamental aspects of this whole project as well. And maybe in relation to that, there was also this, what I call the process corner, where on the right-hand side you see these speech bubbles. And it was basically a wall surface and the table in front of it, which had all these kind of speech bubble pages. And the speech bubble is something that's an image that's so consumed, I wanted to also tackle its existence. But it basically allows anyone who enters the gallery to have a say. So then you end up like a strange collection of statements, anger, whatever, and or complaints or recommendations or news about something happening, or reflection or response to what's taking place or what is there in the gallery. So and I was always thinking of that process corner as you trying to find some way of maybe emulating the beauty of the internet forum, where you have you can have all kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, it does that, but I mean, I'm always also trying to keep some sort of critical distance to the processes in the web, precisely for the reasons I told you. It's like overtly commercialized, and it's always hard to grasp, but I'm also pretty much existing in that context. I mean, I don't have a blog, but I'm kind of, we are all living there, we are all inhabiting the web in some way, I guess, too. So, yeah.
Hello. I was very much interested in your minibar idea. I mean, I'm from Istanbul, and I was even part of these things. And it's very interesting because then you designed a park, and because sometimes when you design something, you imagine that people would go there and then it would end up being empty. And it wouldn't be as successful as these spontaneous gatherness. I was just wondering what kind of elements did you use from these, like mini bars, and implement it into your park installations and make people use them?
I mean, it's on the one hand, yeah, pretty much related to this question of, again, like inhabitancy. So instead of when I was especially doing work around the minibar or the Paperman, I was always very critical to the notion or the sense of control that architects and planners are so obsessed to. So the sense that you can foresee or control how certain actions take place. And that's one line of thing that I would like to believe that you can never preconceive, and you should never preconceive what is to take place in what kind of environment you design or create or build. On the other hand, as I said, I'm also very much interested in this question of meaning and what settings can provoke during their use or also during their empty time. So when I was doing the settings or the parks, I always utilize kind of key elements, key architectural elements such as the stairs, the different surfaces, and very kind of fundamental things, which I also see as I said, almost also as pedestals waiting for something to happen. So in that sense, it's to a certain extent, it's open-ended. But in the park, there is always a huge flux, and there is always a kind of movement that's taking place within the park. So I had no kind of how do you say, deliberate instigators to activate. I don't know, it's not a good phrase to put, but in settings in the art context, I also try and incorporate different modes of production or different modes of gathering to take place within or on top of those settings. Like in the case of the sound platform, I was, again, I briefly went over it, but I was inviting a number of musicians, sound artists, and basically people who work with sound to come and respond to the setting, in the sense that I could never preconceive how they will perform or what they will perform with the setting, but it also for them, it was not their kind of usual PA system, usual stage, or whatever they have in kind of as basics for their performance. So they also had to negotiate, or they also had to find or invent a way of inhabiting the setting as well. So it was a kind of dual exchange of production that starts from not knowing what to produce. I don't know, that's kind of a big word, but so that's like collaboration and some sort of collective production is, I think, what I do to provoke the settings to have life.
Thank you.
We had one.
Any more questions? Oh, we have two questions suddenly.
I'm curious about your relationship with the printed matter as an artist, because we saw some books chained to your settings, and we saw some printouts that people were just, pasting on the wall, and then you started self-publishing. I feel like there's a need to inject the written word somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Is it like you need to explain more, or is it your voice? Do you think it's better?
Mm-hmm.
This is one question, and the other question is about the Partners Gazette. I'm curious why you chose the newspaper medium rather than, a video or something. What was the reason behind?
Thank you. The first question, the relation with printed matter or relationship with text, I mean, that's a really hard question. Didn't see that coming. I mean, I'm trying to trace back how I first started using text in my work. I mean, in the beginning, it was more, in terms of content, to be able to deliver or discuss content. I mean, few of my earlier works involved a lot of more like handwritten material in it, or recordings of certain activities. I mean, I was quite obsessed with this act of recording, taking notes, putting down everything on some kind of paper, and then I was showing this material. Later on, I moved to borrowing or stealing quotes and phrases and sentences that I utilized within my work. And then it moved on to, especially with the minibar, it came to a point that I started using books as some sort of reference material. But then again, I was always dealing with this kind of clash or mis-superimposition between function and meaning. So I was having those books as, let's say, reference material, but I was also sometimes intervening to them or letting people intervene to them in a way that kind of also shifts the meaning or the kind of solidness of the book itself. And also, again, like with this sense of more, let's say, a collective production, working with people and producing something with people, Ahali came also as an outcome of that, trying to bring other people's works that I found were interesting together with my own, and also with your work. Aslı is the designer of Ahali and also the Gazette. So it came about this notion of collective production, and yeah, I mean, it partly has to do with maybe, I don't know if explain is the word, but yeah, to a certain extent explain, but also kind of expand the possibilities of reading, or expand the set of references outside my own work, or outside the, let's say, physical existence of my work, and so that you could jump into different stories or different narratives or different voices of different people, and the kind of accumulation or the growth of this also increases the chances of random encounters as well. As I said, similar to the Ahali context, you can come to an installation of mine, see some material, read something, or encounter somebody's book, but you may totally be missing like 90% of the other material, but that random or chance encounter for me is very valuable, and what that generates is kind of valuable. And with the decision of the newspaper as a medium, I think it's very much relates to your question as well, and the state of the print, the state of journalism, the state of production of newspapers, the power position of, let's say, media, how do you say, media lordships, or yeah, media kingdoms, and also to, I think it also relates to like the freedom of press, which is, in my opinion, getting more and more narrowed, and the newspaper medium is getting more and more narrowed and limited, and also not censored directly, but kind of builds. I mean, if you imagine the context of Italy, that is a very clear kind of context of how the newspapers or how the media works in complicity with power, and then to kind of develop this almost outdated, absurd notion of local press as exactly that kind of space that can allow a community, a contingent community, to have a voice and to address issues that are like super specific to one tiny neighborhood, but that are also super valid in urban context in all around the world. And the processes, I mean, the processes are not so specific as we think they are, and also thus my work is also not really site specific, or I mean my work is site specific, but the sites are not so specific actually. There are so many kind of commonalities and sameness in all these contexts, so that's why, I guess. Thank you.
You have one more question?
Yeah.
Thanks, John, for your introduction, and thanks to referring to Italy. As an Italian, it's always very nice to be addressed as a good example. I would like to know something more. You used the expression intervention plus contribution when you were talking about your work at the park. And I think it's a phrase that could be used also in the Gazette project and in many other of your works. So I would like to know more how you position yourself in this tension between the intervention and the contribution, and if these relate also in your being in between the position of an artist and an architect. So still the need of responding to a certain problematic that space communicate to you, and on the other side there is more, the need to project something else as an artist. I mean, so I would like to know more about this tension.
I mean, first of all, I don't see the contribution as and intervention as a binary opposition, in the sense that they are kind of on like distant ends of equilibrium. But on the other hand, I see them actually really, really close. So, and the conception of contribution or intervention and how it is interpreted is also something very delicate. I mean, this is Zach's phone. Is this yours? Okay, somebody, this is not mine. Somebody decided to intervene. Is this yours? No, okay. Okay. I thought it was yours. But, so anyway, what was I saying? Yeah. So they are actually really close. So in that sense, I find this closeness very interesting, and so I tend to see what I do as both an intervention and contribution. Hopefully, I mean, if they have that power, I'm very happy to be able to intervene or contribute, both of them. But I also understand your question of like how you conceive your practice or your actions, and yes, I think that it will be a kind of grand word, but architects are kind of quite self-illusioned in the sense that they believe they contribute to the world, and it's always something in the form of a contribution, whereas it's not. I mean, a contribution is never only a contribution. It's also something that kind of can be even perceived as totally oppressive action. So I'm very much interested in that closeness, and I don't position myself somewhere on that line. But again, related to the art-architecture dilemma, then I'm also very much interested in the question of function and meaning, as I said, and how meaning is produced, and how, let's say in the applied or design context, how function is seen as the sole meaning, or like a functional object's meaning is only and only its function, whereas how art produces meaning out of anything. And in that sense, I see my work not as unfunctional or against functionality, but it's also always slightly dysfunctional. I mean, all of these projects I have shown you have this kind of dysfunctionality to them, both in the psychological sense, but also in the literal sense, that none of them function properly. But that enables to generate further meaning. So that's also, I think, maybe replies your art architecture. Maybe not.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we could informally continue this conversation also with the presentation of the newspaper here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming.